How's it going, everyone? So before we dive into the episode, I really want to say thank you to everyone that is listening in, that's tuning in, that's enjoying this content and getting value from it. I really love that. That's why I do it. But there's a huge amount of you that are listening that are not subscribed, not following the podcast. And I really want to encourage you to please follow and subscribe to the podcast on whatever platform you are listening or viewing this on. It really helps out the podcast. It helps out the algorithm. It helps more people hear this content that you already find helpful and that they hopefully will as well. So if you go ahead and subscribe or follow the podcast on any platform that you're listening on, and please share it with your friends, that'll be great. All right. Thanks, everyone. Let's get into the episode. How's it going, Jeff? It's great to get you on the podcast. I'm actually really excited for our conversation.
Happy to be here. It took a while to make this arrangement, but I've heard other guests say that, so you must have a way of doing things.
Yeah, it's the
A lot
backlog.
of demand. Let's say it's all demand, right?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, everyone wants to get on this thing, right? But it's interesting when you're running your own podcast and you're working a 9 to 5, right? Because it's like you have to fit it in where you can fit it in. And I used to kind of just open up my entire week for recordings, and I realized that I got burnt out very quickly doing that. And
Right.
so now I dial it into 1 or 2 days a week, like that's my recording period, and then which I guess kind of creates a backlog, right? It creates a backlog of recordings, and it creates a backlog of people trying to get on. Which alleviates, I guess, a lot of the stress that I had in year one of doing this, right? Like we're 3 years in, and year one was just like the worst time trying to find guests last minute. There was so
Right.
many episodes where it was just me talking, it's like, and I'm sitting here like, no one wants to hear me just talk,
That's what those LinkedIn shorts are for.
Yeah, I guess. I hate social media. Now, I didn't hate it that much before podcasting, but now that my growth, right, is kind of determined based on my engagement that I get on social media, I hate it so much more. And I wish I was making the money to just hire like a social media manager, just like,
Right.
here, just figure all this out,
Yeah, like many things, a necessary evil that aren't going away anytime soon. Me, I'm focused on how soon can I retire and just walk away from everything.
Right.
But still a few years away. I am having fun at a lot of levels doing what I'm doing these days, but definitely there's days when I would love to just, walk away from all of it. I mean, I could be being blackballed on social media and doxed and DOSed, and I wouldn't even know it because I just don't get on that much. But yeah, it is what it is.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm sure we will get there in our conversation, but to start, why don't you talk about how you got into security, right? The reason why I ask everyone this question is because there is a portion of my viewership or listeners, whatever platform they're on, that are trying to make that jump into IT or security, right?
Right.
And they probably don't know if it's possible for them, right? They might be coming from various backgrounds, and I feel like it's always helpful for everyone to hear someone else's background, right? Because I remember when I was trying to get into specifically the federal government, right? It was extremely helpful for me to hear someone that came from even my same area, right? Same background even, and
Right.
he made it. And so I was like, well, if he made it, then why can't I make it? Right. And
Right.
so getting that mentality switch, I think, is key for everyone. So how did you get into it?
Well, I got into this in the early mid 1980s, so back in the 1900s, before the internet was a thing, before cell phones and mobile phones were a thing. People barely had computers, what were called desktop or personal computers back in those days. I've actually told this story in one of the talks I've given at conferences, and I think there's recordings of it out on YouTube somewhere. The name of the talk is Hackers Are Neither Created Nor Destroyed. Given that nothing existed back then, there was no training courses, no certifications. The real question is, well, the short answer to your question is I worked for some time for the National Security Agency, and I started out as a cryptologist. But the real answer to the question is, how did I get to NSA? And I chuckle because when I was putting this talk together and sort of thinking back about my origin story, um, I think, the NSA that exists today, they probably would never hire me, um, just for all sorts of different reasons, mostly because they're always looking for very specific skills. And even when I was applying to NSA back in the mid 80s, they didn't call it STEM back then. They just called it critical skills. They were looking primarily for engineers, mathematicians, and computer scientists. And I won't tell the whole story, but I went through the sort of the traditional route. I sent in an application, the government SF 171 form, and by mail, U.S. Postal Service type mail. Got a response and was invited to Fort Meade, to NSA headquarters, actually to one of their satellite offices, to go through a couple days worth of sort of aptitude skills testing. And I forget exactly how many tests there were, 10 or 12 or 14 tests. Long story short is I scored well enough on all these aptitude tests that they hired me without any kind of position in mind, which was, they were hiring a lot of people back then. They were doing a lot of recruiting at universities, again, hiring these critical skills, trying to entice people out of college as they graduated college to come work for NSA. And back in those days, nobody knew what NSA was, by the way. They didn't advertise. We weren't allowed to say that we worked at NSA. We could only say we worked for the Department of Defense back in those days. But I ended up going to work for, my first assignment was in a manual crypto systems branch in what at the time was called communications security, which was sort of the defensive side of the house, later to become known as information security director, or InfoSec, thus my start in information security. How I knew I was in the right place was I grew up in a family that loved to do puzzles. And one of my favorite pastimes was doing the Dell crossword puzzle book, which had logic problems in it. And I loved doing the logic problems. My first assignment in this manual crypto system branch, I had a mentor who was a cryptanalyst on loan from the operations side of the house. One day at lunchtime, he was doing some stuff with graph paper and colored pencils, and I kind of asked him, "What are you doing?" He says, "I'm writing logic problems. As a side job, I write logic problems for Dell Crossword Puzzle magazine." And that was just one of these karma, oh, I know I'm in the right place kind of moments. But for people that are listening that want to break into the industry, I would say, and I say this a lot to people that ask this question, don't get hung up on the technology things, the STEM things. While that's important and while we need people with those skills, there's a lot of other skills out there that people are looking for. I liked logic problems, so I had sort of a logical mindset, which kind of made me good at math, but I'm not a mathematician. Critical thinking, abstract thinking, people that are involved in music and are good at music. It's really what makes you a hacker, and how I decided at some point, oh, I am a hacker. What are the attributes? Not accepting answers, thinking there's a better answer or a better way, liking to tinker, take things apart, find out how things work, curiosity, being organized. During COVID, I talked to some people somewhere along the line, people that were getting laid off from restaurants that were like chefs and short order cooks. Have to be really skilled and organized. And they were getting into cybersecurity and finding out they were really good at things, related to cybersecurity, because they had such good organizational skills, leadership skills, able to sort things out and do things, multitasking, and so on and so forth. So there's lots of different things that might make you good in this field. I'm not really a good textbook example because I just kind of stumbled upon it, frankly. I got into it, and it was I got into hacking and computer hacking at the beginning of sort of everybody doing it. again, no training courses, no certifications or degrees. So, I've always kind of scoffed at certifications and I've kind of scoffed at degrees, but I realize that they're necessary for people. But, my pedigree is I lived it, I grew up in it, which not everybody can say. So acknowledging that, I try to uh, do as much as I can to just impart knowledge and experience that I've had over the years on the next generation, and try to encourage people to, don't give up, try new things, try different things, find your niche, find out what you like to do, find out what you're good at, and do that. That type of thing. Long-winded answer, but that's sort of my background story.
No, but I think it's really interesting, because you didn't. We always think of, I mean, even I do to this day, right? When
Hmm.
I'm thinking of someone that goes in the NSA, I mean, these guys are, mathematicians and cryptologists and some of the absolute smartest of the smart, right? Like I've applied to the NSA previously, years ago, right? And
Right,
even when I was applying, I was thinking like, why the hell are they going to choose me? What? I'm not a mathematician. Yeah, I like math, but that doesn't make me anything special in math. What value would they get out of me, right?
right.
And you came into it in a period where, they were more open, right, to skill sets and potential skill sets rather than, you know, I guess the accreditations on paper that they're looking forward to right now more, right? They're looking for those people that have the degrees in math, right? And the degrees in, cryptology, the experience, from a company like RSA, for instance, that
Hmm.
has been doing crypto for 10 years, right? That's what they're looking for now. The bar is much higher.
Right. Well, I also came into NSA at a time when we were still fighting the Cold War with the Soviet Union. It was during the Reagan administrations, and uh, one of the big strategies there was basically to try to bankrupt the Soviet Union, which is
Hmm.
effectively what happened. So there's a lot of money being poured into the Defense Department. They were literally hiring 100 people a week at NSA.
Wow.
They were casting a pretty wide net, and they were growing through attrition because, I don't know the exact numbers, but let's say, 80 out of the 100 people that they were hiring were people coming straight out of college or people that with these critical skills degrees, and they would immediately put them into what they called the 2020 program, so you could go get your graduate degree and have the government pay for it and only work half time, 20 hours of work, 20 hours of school. So people were coming in with these advanced skills. Oh, by the way, they were paying them extra. There was an accelerated pay scale, immediately sending them to school and paying for their degree. And the vast majority of these people would get their degrees, fulfill their requirement to the government for having gotten all this stuff, which at the time, it was time of service, but the clock was running while they were there. Somebody figured it out, but you could basically get your graduate degree and leave like 2 or 3 months later and go out into the private sector, make more money, never look back. And a lot of people did that. So NSA was, I don't know if it was their strategy or not, but they were growing incrementally by bringing in a lot of people and saving the ones that survived or didn't leave, which you would think would be like second class citizens, and the ones that weren't the cream of the crop that couldn't go out and get the job in the private sector. I don't know, because that kind of puts me into that category. I like to think I'm different, but you know I graduated from college with a human resource management degree. So it was a business major, and I had a whopping 2.6.5 grade point average. And somehow but I was good at some stuff and I scored well on aptitude tests. And I just happened to be at the right place at the right time and had the mindset of a hacker where, uh, when I was asked to do things and, could we do something differently? Could we do something that hasn't been done before? I was naive enough to say, I don't see why not. So let's do it. So I had some early successes at NSA, doing some, as it turns out, innovative things, and, sort of rounded out my career at NSA. effectively architecting the first red team at NSA, getting into ethical hacking and penetration testing, because a lot of us that worked in this one little group saw the movie Sneakers, had the mission of doing evaluations of fielded systems, including network systems. We called them distributed systems at the time. And somebody in our team said, "Why don't we just start learning how to be hackers?" That movie came out, and we all remember the classic movie War Games. It's like we should be doing that instead of just sort of the controlled scientific engineering oriented analyses that we had been doing. So, right place at the right time, and the right mindset or persona that I happened to be able to, and was naive enough to think that we could do things differently, which is hard to do at very large government bureaucratic organizations, which is one of the reasons why I left there. But that's another story for another day.
So what's the overall mission statement of the NSA? And it leads into my next question. So I know it's pretty basic, but what is it, at least when you were there?
Well, I don't know that we had a mission statement per se, but the way I used to describe it was we were sort of the nation's ear. We were the ones that were listening to what people were saying, and of course we were doing that globally, and we were listening to all sorts of different things, which were primarily in those days radio signals of one frequency or another, maybe a little bit of telephone traffic, a whole lot of radio traffic, and other creative ways that we could intercept communications. But the mission was more or less, we were an information gathering agency, sort of adjacent to things like the CIA, which were the actual spies, hiring people to commit espionage and stuff like that. Whereas NSA was just sort of the big ear where we were listening to everything, and any kind of data or signal that we could collect in any number of classified ways. If it happened to be encrypted in some way, of course, NSA was known for being code breakers, cryptanalysts, and so that was a large part of the mission. But that was what we called operations, which was probably about 80% of the mission at the time that I was there, and the exact number is probably classified, but it's been a long time. The other side of the house, what came to be known as InfoSec, was responsible for producing all the secure communications cryptographic systems that were being used by U.S. Special Forces, anybody in the military, anybody had a classified mission, State Department, embassies, and so on and so forth. So we were making all the little black boxes at those times. It was very much an engineering organization, and there was very much a mentality that I mean, very distinctly remember a chief scientist saying, there's really no such thing as software. Everything we do is hardware, or let's say firmware based in the modern dialect. But the idea of doing something in software, which is something I did early on, was very, very foreign to the powers that be on the information security side. Very much build a little black box where message traffic, communications traffic would go in whatever form, some kind of crypto would happen, and out would come the code or the cipher that would be transmitted, and somebody had the box on the other end that would reverse the process and get back to whatever it was that the message traffic was. Primarily communications traffic back then. It wasn't as much storing secrets and protecting secrets that were what we call these days data at rest. It very much had to do with, the organization was called Communications Security when I first started there, because we were intercepting the secrets that were being transmitted, passed from one end to another. That's actually an important distinction, because I think that's one of the huge changes that came about with the dawn of the internet age and the digital age, is we started sharing a lot of information, but wanted to have some way to put the data online and make it freely available to everybody, but only certain people. So we had to come up with all sorts of different ways of trying to protect data, and started thinking about different levels of the classification of the data, the different sensitivities. Of course, back when I started, if we had data at rest, it was necessarily all printed on paper. and locked in safes and locked rooms and locked buildings with guards and guns and machine gun nests and barbed wire fences and so on and so forth. Very, very much the mission back then was communication security and everything involved in communications, whether it was listening and decoding what everybody else was saying, and then reporting that to the decision makers, the military leaders, the Congress, the president, and so on and so forth, so they could have information to make better informed decisions about, are we going to go to war with somebody, or whatever whatever the question was at the time.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. Back then, was the NSA very siloed? It doesn't sound like it was very siloed. Now, right, 10 years ago at this point, 10 years ago, I did a little bit of work with some agencies, and I mean, it is so siloed. It is siloed within silos, right? And it is it's crazy how it's kind of crazy how they get anything done. To be completely honest with you, because it's like, I was working with one guy on the left side of this aisle, right? Massive aisle, right? Takes you 10 minutes to walk from one end to the other in a building.
Right.
And I'm working with the guy on the left, and he gave me what he could tell me that he works on, right?
Right.
And I was like, well, what's he work on right across the aisle, right? Like, they've known each other for 30 years. They've worked together for 30 years at different agencies and things like that, right? And he said, I don't know. And I was like, no, but you know, do you actually know, or do you actually not know? He goes, no, I've known him for 30 years. I have no clue what he works on. All I know is he works on the same product family as I do, and that's it. And I was like, what? And then,
Yeah.
you could go all the way down the aisle and everyone will give you the same answer. And, maybe that is a part of the veil, right? Where they're not going to tell you because you're not cleared or whatever it is, right? But I feel like when you go to 30, 40, 50 people, and I mean, I wasn't a podcaster at the time, right? But I'm able to talk to people. I'm able to typically, get information out of people in different ways, right? When they give you the same answer of, no, I don't know what they work on. I've known them for years, right? Was that the case back then, or was it a little bit more open for you to, maybe talk to the guys, right, that created the black box, and now you're creating the software that goes into that black box? And because now I don't think that someone in your position creating that software, I don't even think that you would know that there's a black box, right? They're just saying, create a software that does this, right?
No, there were certainly silos, and a lot of the concept was actually very deliberate. We didn't call it silos; we called it compartmentalization, and it had to do from an information security or data security perspective. I mean, we still have the concept these days. Need to know. We talk about it in terms of escalation of privileges and access to different areas in the technology and our data storage and databases and things like that. But the concept is simply, the fewer people that know about something that's very sensitive, the better, because then you have fewer people that are going to have loose lips. Loose lips sink ships. No World War One security poster. The fewer people that, if it is discovered that some information is leaked, the fewer people to investigate. There's just all sorts of different reasons why you had compartmentalization. I had the top secret compartmented information, TSSCI clearance, as most people, pretty much everybody at NSA did. But even beyond that, if you were working on a different problem, and problems, let's say, were loosely geography related, geopolitically related, very much, different compartments, different security clearances that you would have to get read into, sign papers promising that you're not going to reveal secrets about it, and so on and so forth. and very much dependent on what the target was, what the object of interest was. And it could be very literally right next door to one another, and you really wouldn't know what the other people are doing. And that was primarily on the operations side of the house. On the defensive side of the house, the information security side of the house, it wasn't quite as tight-lipped, I guess, and quite as compartmental. And I'm sure there were compartments. None come to mind immediately, but I can tell you that the office that I first worked in, one of the things that I ended up starting to develop was I was involved in a project that was upgrading what was called the communications base station for U.S. Special Forces. The one that they had at the time was it took two entire 18-wheeler trucks to comprise this supposedly mobile communications base station.
Yep.
One of the trucks was primarily the power plant. The other one was filled up with all sorts of equipment. They were trying to modernize and make use of things like laptop computers. And so a contractor had come up with a design for doing a lot of what this thing was doing, but do it in software in a laptop. And so what took two semi trucks to create a base station was being reduced to, I'm looking at the picture of it now, 15 transit cases that were 2 feet by 2 feet by 2 feet. I just grabbed the picture and showed to you. A picture is worth 1,000 words. So this is what was being designed as the replacement for two trucks. Much more transportable, much more meeting the original goal of mobile, because the truck ones basically weren't mobile. The key element to that was the encrypted communications that they were doing, which was with what was called a one-time pad. The one-time pad key, which was printed on paper pads and was used by the troops in the field, the Green Berets, the A teams. At the base station, the same key was being printed on the old-fashioned paper tapes that you used in the early days of computers. They came to us and said, "Is there any way we can get the key instead of on paper tape on a floppy disk? Because then we can feed it in the laptop, do the encryption decryption." I had conveniently already done that for another customer, and so we were able to do it for these guys, and so help them in the project. So that's something I was working on for quite a while. I was having lunch one day with a guy that literally worked the office next door to me, and we're like, "So what have you been working on? What have you been working on?" And he was showing me something that he was working on in terms of this electronic crypto device that had, the little black box was now going to be more like firmware in something that looked kind of sort of some of today's modern phones that kind of flip open with a keypad. But it was something back then that was called a KL43. You can Google that. And as he was describing his client that he was doing it for, I'm like, well, that sure sounds a lot like my client. So we started comparing notes, and lo and behold, we were working on two very different things, but going after the same problem. And it turned out that the customer had two different offices, let's say, that approached two different offices at NSA. So we could point fingers as to where the replication was going on, but literally we were right next door to each other, both involved in multi-million-dollar, multi-year design projects, research and development projects to satisfy the same base requirement from one customer. So yeah, it happened even on the InfoSec side of the house.
Huh. That's really interesting. That also isn't like completely out of the realm after working with the government that they would spend, double the money on the same exact project, basically.
Right.
Which is, there's a reason why toilets cost like $50,000 or whatever it is, right? Like at the Pentagon. Like that's always the joke.
Yeah, the epilogue to this, and I'll share this just because it matters to me, is after I left that office, which was before the completion of this project, and it bubbled up to management, "Hey, we've got two different efforts going on that are basically going after the same thing. Somebody from that office sent me an internal memo some months later that came from the top levels of the Army, because that's who the customer was, um, saying that my system was what they were going to go with, and they were going to cancel the other one. So I won, at least in the short term.
Awesome.
It mattered
Yeah,
to me at the time. Trust me.
yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's a huge thing, because I always felt like, especially at the facility that I was at, right? It was broken up into four major modules, and each module would have a different, telecom system, would have a different OS, would have completely different things. And each module was competing against the other. So,
Mm-hmm.
if X phone system ever went down, they would just, promote Y, and
Right.
Y is a totally different product, and they're all competing against each other. So it's not like, it's not completely out of the realm, like uh, when, I guess when companies, maybe the best way to think about it, a company will have one phone system for 30 years, right?
Mm-hmm.
They'll pay for Cisco, they'll pay for Avaya, they'll pay for whatever. Well, imagine having four phone systems. They're all different. You have four totally different teams that are running it,
Right.
and that's what that's like. It's a environment like none other. And one of the things that I kind of got a glimpse at was the technology that they were using.
Mm-hmm.
The technology seemed to be, I mean, it seemed to be, from what I saw, right? And I'm not even seeing the cutting edge, the top tier stuff, right? But even that stuff seemed to be 5 to 10 years ahead of whatever was on the market, right? Whatever you could purchase right now as a private citizen, it's probably 5 to 10 years ahead.
Right.
Is that Does that remain true back when you were at the agency? Did you, you know, work on stuff that you were saying like this will come out in, 2000 or whatever it might be, right? And you're looking at advertisements for, the newest stuff, right? When you go home or whatever, and you're
Mm-hmm.
saying, "Man, we were like that's nothing at work." Like, is that the case, or maybe not so much?
Well, my opinion only, I should say, and
Right.
and certainly I didn't have a complete view into everything, but my experience was rather sort of the exact opposite. What you're describing is sort of the one of the fundamental principles of the free enterprise system, is the idea of competition, and the idea that there's competition is going to drive innovation and the best products to come out at the best price. This might go back to, sort of the military mindset that NSA was built around, because I can remember, I worked with a lot of people that were enlisted and officers, third to half of the workforce were military people at any given time. And I'm making that number up because the exact number is probably classified. But I can remember one of them one time, they're passing out a list of uh, aphorisms, true statements that were true for the military. And one that always stood out to me was, remember when you're in a firefight that your rifle was built by the low bidder. But even I think, the InfoSec side of the house being more or less an engineering organization that did not have competition. They were kind of the one-stop shop for many years. I think that actually, in some ways, hindered the innovation. Two quick stories. One is, there was a time when we had a multi-million-dollar contract with one of the branches of the military, and that branch was coming back to NSA saying, "Why are we spending millions of dollars on you to develop something? There's this thing that's kind of out, that's open source, that's freeware, called Pretty Good Privacy, PGP. Google it, you younger people." The guy that wrote it was in trouble with the government for, they were trying to prosecute him for a long time, because he basically came up with a free encryption software that was as good, if not better, than some of the stuff that NSA was producing, and it was free. But crypto at the time was classified as materiel. It was like munitions, and so it couldn't
Yeah.
be exported. And how do you control the export or import of something that's on the internet? Phil Zimmerman is the guy that wrote PGP. They tried to prosecute him for a long time, but there was a day and I was in the InfoSec side of the house where a mandate was put out from the deputy director saying, our contract and our livelihood is being threatened by this freeware package called PGP. Everybody stop what they're doing and try to come up with an attack against it, to try to sully its name and prove that it's not as secure as our stuff. I won't tell you what the outcome was, but I'll tell you that PGP is still around today in some forums, and some people still use it. And of course, public key cryptography and so on and so forth has won the day. I mean, nobody's getting their cryptographic keys in search from NSA anymore because it's all out there in the wild. So you can imagine where that went. I'll leave it there, A, because I forgot what my second story was going to be, and B, that's probably more poignant anyway.
Well, what was that like starting the first red team at the agency? Well, one,
Well,
what
A,
is
we didn't call ourselves a red team. That was a term that was assigned to us much later on. But we were, we're a small group of guys, or four of us initially, that were just kind of, interested in this new thing called computer hacking and network hacking, internet security. And we were charged with the mission of evaluating the security of network systems anyway. So somebody said, why don't we just learn how to hack? And so we all just started learning how to hack. And I had hair back then. I grew it long. We were trying to live kind of the hacker lifestyle. While we were doing this was when the movie Hackers came out. So things were happening out in the public. Like 2600 was around back in the early days. You had the Anarchist Cookbook that was available on the internet. I mean, everything was new, and the internet was new, and having information at your fingertips through a browser. World Wide Web is what we called it at the beginning. It was all new, and everything that was written up into that point, everything that was designed up into that point was trying to facilitate and foster fast, easy communication and data sharing. So the idea of protecting it in any kind of way, shape, or form was really kind of foreign. So needless to say, it was sometimes very easy for us to break into things because most of the time what we were doing was just taking advantage of what we would have called features. It wasn't a bug in the operating system. It was the way the thing was designed. And, back in the early days, there used to be talk about, when you would buy something new, like buy a new computer or buy a new server, you never wanted to plug it in out of the box because it had everything turned on by defaults because they wanted you to be able to use it and have it work. So it was up to you, the consumer, to lock things down, to harden things. So to this day, there's hardening guides, there's configuration guides and requirements to follow, things like that. Although, the big players like Microsoft have, gone leaps and bounds into doing much more security out of the box for new systems and new servers and applications and operating systems and so forth. But it was the Wild Wild West in the early days. So we were just sponges and just learning as much as we could. And we tried on our own systems and networks and look at that, it works. But we were learning from the same sources that everybody else was, what hacker websites there were, bug track, people that are reporting vulnerabilities or having problems fixing things, various news groups and RSS feeds and so on and so forth. 2600, I think we all subscribed to it. Anything we could get our hands on. What made it tricky though for us was because our targets were classified systems, the lawyers that tried to provide some ground rules for us to do what we wanted to do, they made the declaration that anything we do has to be classified at the same level as our target. So if we're targeting mostly top secret systems, literally everything we did had to be classified top secret because of the sort of the traditional way of classifying things and the touch rule and the association. And if you have a way of breaking into a top secret network, it makes sense at some level. You want to keep that a secret too, so that needs to be protected according to the same rules that any top secret information. So there was a reason for it. It became very impractical when we're pulling most of the things that we were doing, which was more techniques than exploits back in those days, although there were some exploits too, but we were getting them off the internet. It was freeware, it was open source, and yet as soon as we touched it, it became classified top secret. I gave a talk years ago about sort of the origins of the red team, and I have to caveat in this talk, I can't tell you what we did because it's still classified. All I can do is tell you what was the trade craft that was popular of the day, and you can put two and two together and draw your own conclusions. But because I don't want to have people in the black suits show up at my door and haul me off someday, I will caveat and say I can't tell you what exactly we were doing, but use some common sense. And then at some point I say, okay, I'll tell you one top secret trade craft that was a very common tool that we use. And I proceed to tell them about the ping command. Ping command, because we used it, literally was classified top secret. And we couldn't tell people that we used the ping command. And worse than that, to get all the management approvals and authorizations to do these pen tests and this ethical hacking, trying to break into something, we were supposed to describe our attack scenario and our methodology ahead of time and have everybody pre-approve it. So before we could even issue a ping command, we had to go through a weeks-long process of getting authorizations, in theory, to be able to ping a target, ping scan a network segment, ping a box to see what it was, and this is long before the days of any kind of commercial vulnerability scanner, like most people know Nessus these days. Ironically, the guy that founded the company that produced Nessus was one of the guys on our team. So there is a connection there. But back in those days, we had two freeware versions of vulnerability scanners. One was called ISS, and one was called Satan. And you can imagine at a government or top secret organization that's very politically minded how well using Satan went over as a tool. But it had to be classified top secret if, in fact, we used it. I might have revealed a secret.
Yeah, maybe a couple of years ago at this point, I talked to someone that was a cyber warfare officer for the military, right?
Mm-hmm.
And he talked about how he would be handed target packages and he would be tasked with creating essentially, the payload, the exploit, whatever it was, the entire thing, and putting it all into essentially a command and never hitting enter. He's not allowed to hit enter. That goes to someone else where they hit enter on their keyboard after it gets approved and everything else like that. And, the amount of times that he said that, things would change, right? In between the time that he created it and the time that it was approved and then it was actually executed was significant. And it was very frustrating because that process is so long and, arduous to go through just for basic things, basic things. You have to change permissions on a file or whatever it might be, simple, terminal tasks, right? It's really fascinating to me. And, were you ever handed a target package that you couldn't get into, that you couldn't find, anything against? I would think back then that it would be a whole lot easier than it is today, because now today everyone's kind of hyper aware of security. And so even I feel like even the just regular average desktop is a little bit more difficult to get in. And maybe that's my naivety, right? It's a little bit more difficult to get in today than it would have been 20, 30 years ago, right? Because everyone is so hyper aware. I need to deploy these patches.
Well, the short answer is no. I was never handed a package because we, for the time that I was involved, we were so new that we didn't have really a formalized methodology for delivery of services, so we weren't well known. I mean, I talked to an old manager from that time last summer. Caught up with him, found him on Facebook several years ago, and then COVID happened. But we finally got together for lunch, and we were talking about things like the TAO. And I was like, did the TAO come, spring from what we were doing? He goes, no, not really. I know where it came from. It was from a different area of NSA. But he kind of scratched his head and thought a little bit. He says, no, what you guys were doing, and we called ourselves the Pit, by the way. That was our nickname for our office, but in the folklore, the Pit was the first red team at NSA. But he said, you guys were kind of the beginning of what's now U.S. Cyber Command. So, that's how far back we go. I mean, I started doing this as near as I can remember back in 1992. So over 30 years ago, I was breaking into what was mostly Unix systems and mainframes back in those days. But in as much as we were kind of new, we didn't have a very formalized methodology and a formalized way of approaching us and engaging us. And most of what we were doing back then was teaching people about Unix file permissions and directory settings and things called set UID permissions, which basically any application or service that was running on Unix, many of the early ones that were written had to be executed as root in order to perform. So even, so there was a bit that was set in the permission that when it executed, anybody could run it. But when it was running, it was basically running it as root. And if you could get it to crash and hiccup, very often it would dump out into a shell, but retain its status. So it would be a root shell. Very common back then. And, probably 80 or 90% of the services and applications that were available on any Unix system out of the box had these set UID bits set to execute as root. That's the type of thing we were doing, and it was much more teaching people sort of, basic hygiene. And we were figuring it out as we went along, what's good and bad. And, we used to joke all the time, well, this is a feature. This isn't a bug. And that's, a lot of people were doing that. And that's why we started to have hardening guides and hardening standards and things that you need to do if you're going to install or turn on a Unix server or a Unix workstation, or later on a Windows workstation or server. Here's all the, 10 million things that you need to do to lock it down before you let it loose on your network.
What's the TAO group?
Gosh, what is TAO? Everybody's listening is going to shout it out. Technical Access Organization. That's not right. I could Google it real quick.
Tailored Access?
Tailored Access, thank you. It was a group that was exposed by WikiLeaks several years ago, back when the whole Edward Snowden things and Julian Assange kind of stuff was going on. It was basically a super secret group at NSA that would do a lot what I think what you were describing as being handed a package and then go do stuff, and very surreptitiously. So it was a very super secret organization, but a lot of people got outed as very few people knew it existed, especially not in the public realm, and so it kind of got blown up, and a lot of their exploits were exposed publicly and so on and so forth. So a lot of people know about TAO kind of from the whole Edward Snowden, WikiLeaks type of thing. So that's why I brought up TAO. I was not responsible for the predecessor. I'm not an ancestor of TAO. I'm apparently an ancestor of U.S. Cyber Command, which was, much more mission focused and sort of upfront about defense, really, still, as opposed to offense. And again, we started doing this ethical hacking, breaking into networks in the early days to test the security, and let's see how secure you are, and find the holes and the vulnerabilities by attempting to break in. Which, by the way, is pretty much the movie plot to the movie Sneakers, which I happen to be wearing a T-shirt that is a reference to the movie Sneakers. But that was kind of our inspiration. And ironically, to this day, most red teaming companies, pen testing companies, kind of follow a very similar methodology, especially if they're doing physical access. So if you've not seen the movie Sneakers and you're trying to break into the industry, there is sort of a canon of movies that you should watch, and that some of them are old. But War Games is the classic, came out in 1983, Matthew Broderick. Sneakers, which came out in 1992, Robert Redford and Ben Kingsley. A huge cast of really famous names at the time are in that movie. 1995, Hackers, Angelina Jolie. Same year, a movie called The Net, which hardly ever gets any attention, although I met somebody at a conference a couple weeks ago, and they said that The Net was their favorite hacker movie. Sandra Bullock, also 1995. Other movies since then, but those are sort of the classics of the original kind of hackers being pimply faced high school kids that lived in their parents' basement and never saw the light of day, and had the black hoodie, and knew everything about computers and breaking in. So anyway.
Yeah. So, Jeff, I want to ask you, what made you stay in the agency for so long? Because you said in the beginning, right, there's a significant amount of turnover, and someone, figured out how they could essentially leave in, under a year or so, right? So I'm sure you probably knew about that method and whatnot at that time. And I'm sure you probably even, thought about it, right? Like, is that something I want to do? Maybe I want to stay here. What was, the things that you weighed to stay at the agency for so long? And then why did you end up, leaving when you did?
There's a whole story to why I left, and I'll try to make it short for you. But when I came to the agency, because I wasn't critical skill, I was not given. I was on the regular pay scale, didn't have the accelerated pay scale, so I got paid less than everybody else. Didn't qualify for a lot of the extra programs because they were just for the critical skill people. There's intern programs that existed for all the different skill groups and disciplines within the agency, and you had to go through the intern program to get all the different qualifications to be what was called being professionalized, which was a threshold to, if you ever wanted to be promoted on the GS scale from a 12 to a 13, you had to have professionalization, which is sort of a modern equivalent of certification. Like everybody in this industry has to have a CISSP type of thing. So, part of my motivation for staying, and I was there for 10 years, was I was doing cool stuff. I had and have kind of a chip on my shoulder that I wasn't given all this special opportunity, and the people that were, they weren't really doing anything in particular, whereas I was doing stuff. And very, very quickly, the reason I left, and I tell this story more in depth with the talk that I'm giving this year. I've given it several times, and I got a couple more to give. I think the next one will be at, am I giving this talk at DEF CON? I am not. I'm keynoting B-Sides Edmonton, Alberta in September, and I'll be giving this talk in GERCON, which is Grand Rapids, end of September. So if you want to hear the story, full story there. But essentially, we were doing this pen testing exercise, and we were asked to do it for a civil agency, so not a non-classified network. We ran into some political issues in terms of things that are similar to what Snowden was bringing to light. But when that was exposed and we got in trouble, and because I was the team leader, I was the one that was really in trouble when there was a particular incident that happened in late August or mid-August of 1996. I was gone from NSA before the end of September 1996. So there was a significant incident that happened that was life-changing, that changed the course of my career, and within 6 weeks I was gone from
Wow.
NSA. I'll have to leave it at that because this is only an hour podcast, and it's a pretty lengthy story.
Yeah, that means
So a
I definitely
teaser
need to bring
goes.
you back.
Go see me at GurCon or B-Sides Edmonton, or look for, I don't know if I've seen this talk, even though I've given the talk a lot this year, I don't know that it's been recorded much. But as a teaser, I've given 3 sets of talks over the years that tell my NSA story. The first one was Tales from the Cryptanalyst, which was when I was actually a cryptanalyst. And then the sequel, I have stickers too to promote it. More Tales from the Cryptanalyst, which is where I tell more of the in-depth story of the origins of the first Red Team and the pit. And then this year, it's Tales from the Crypt, the afterlife. What did I do after I left NSA abruptly at the end of 1996 up until roughly 2004, where I started doing PCI. It started out as how did I get into a PCI talk? Somebody that's a former NSA cryptographer. I'm considering resurrecting all 3 of these stickers. So if you do go to GurCon, I'm hoping to have the box set of the stickers available, as it were. I mean, free for giveaway.
Yeah, that would be pretty awesome. Jeff, I really want to go longer, but I guess that just means, that I have to bring you back on
You have to bring
for
me
a
back.
part 2.
The last podcast that interviewed me, they let me talk for 3 hours. So I'll say,
Which podcast was that?
it's called The Team House.
I think I heard like the first hour of that.
Yep. Well, I think it went viral because I don't know what constitutes viral, but it's at 115,000 views the last time I checked, which was earlier today. So I don't know what their audience is. Very diverse because they talk about special operations and warfare. So I think they got a lot of military-minded people, not just cybersecurity people. But yeah, I'm happy to come back anytime because all we've done is the intro.
Yeah, right.
We've touched lightly on the first 10 years of what's more than 40 years in the business. So I'm happy to come back as time allows.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm definitely gonna get you back on the schedule. Let's come back on. Let's do a part 2.
Sure.
That'll be awesome. Well, Jeff, before I let you go, why don't you tell my audience, where they could find you if they wanted to reach out, and maybe even, the link to, whatever company you're working for if you want to put that out.
Sure. I work for a company called Online Business Systems. The website is www.obsglobal.com. And I do primarily consulting and advising from a security perspective, but primarily for PCI, the payment card industry. I just finished my first version 4 report on compliance earlier today. It's going through final review, and then it'll be signed and delivered to the client. But I've literally been doing PCI for the last 20 years, which is disturbing on some levels, but there's a reason why I do it. It's kind of a love-hate relationship. But we can have a story about that. I also, on the side, I'm a co-host of a podcast called Paul's Security Weekly, which you can find at securityweekly.com. Do quite a bit of conference speaking. I've been out there a bunch this year. As I said, I'll be speaking at DEF CON at the Crypto and Privacy Village. And there's apparently something new at DEF CON this year called Creator Stage, where all the villages submitted like their top 2 or 3 talks to this Creator Stage. So I think I'm doing that. And I assume that means it's a separate talk. I'm not sure. They're also resurrecting Sky Talks, but instead of it being affiliated with DEF CON, this year it's affiliated with B-Sides Las Vegas. So I'm going to be doing a Sky Talk sort of adjacent to B-Sides Las Vegas. I think it's actually at the hotel next door. I forget the name, from the Tuscany. So I'll be speaking at DEF CON and B-Sides Las Vegas, what we call Hacker Summer Camp. And then B-Sides Edmonton, if you happen to be Canadian, and want to come up to Edmonton, Alberta. It's beautiful in September. It's not minus 30 yet. but I'm keynoting B-Sides Edmonton up there, and then the last weekend of September, so it's like the 27th, 28th, or 29th, somewhere in that range is GurCon, and that's in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Highly recommend going to GurCon if you want to go to a hacker conference. It's some of the hacker conferences aren't with us anymore. Some are fast going away, but it's holding its own, and it's a pretty decently sized but not too big hacker conference, where it's not too big where you can't have conversations with people and have pretty good networking sessions without the crush of humanity like some people experience at things like DEF CON.
Yeah.
So that's it for the pitches. I'm on LinkedIn, type my name in, spell it right. Google me, again, spell my name right. You'll find me in different places. I'm sort of on Twitter, but I'm not, just like everybody else.
Yeah.
I'm on Facebook, but I'm not. I don't do social media. We started the conversation.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, thanks, Jeff, for coming on. I'm probably gonna go to one of the conferences that you mentioned, so I'll definitely be in touch, and maybe we'll meet up for a drink or so
Sounds
over
good.
there.
All right.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks everyone. I hope you enjoyed this episode.
Thank you.